So today we are going to continue talking about the brain, and we had this kind of layout and how the brain was divided into these three major sections. We had the proencephalon, which is commonly called the forebrain, and that's actually the largest part of the brain. We have the mesencephalon, which is called the midbrain, and you can't see that from the outside because it's literally in the middle of your brain. And then we have the rhombencephalon, which is commonly called the hindbrain, and how that's a little misleading because it's actually not the back of your brain, it's more of the underside. And so we talked about how you can kind of, with the forebrain, it divides into two parts. You have the telencephalon, which is commonly called the cerebrum, and you have the diencephalon. Di meaning two, it's going to have two parts to it. But the telencephalon is what we call the cerebrum, and it is the largest portion of the brain. And it contains the core, and it contains the cortex. And the diencephalon, which is still part of the forebrain, you have the hypothalamus, and you have the thalamus. Then when we get to the midbrain, you have this group of nerves called the core quads, and this highway we call the peduncle. And then you have the hindbrain, which is really a lot of times what we call your brain stem. You have the second largest part of your brain, which is the cerebellum, and this we've talked about is the part of your brain that controls your skeletal muscles. And then you have the medulla and the pons, and these actually aren't really part of your brain. They're actually part of your spinal cord. They make up what we call your brain stem, but they're considered to be parts of your brain because they're actually connected to your brain inside of your skull. So what we're going to focus on today is this part here called the telencephalon. We've already talked about the meninges, and we talked about the ventricles and this stuff called cerebral spinal fluid. And we talked about sulcus and gyrus and fissures, and how a sulcus is like a bump on your brain. And so like this here, these would all be sulci. And fissures and these would be the gyrus. And then your sulci would be these folds that you have here. And if the fold is deep enough that it almost cuts the brain in half, remember we called that a fissure. So we talked about the flax cerebri, which is the fissure that goes up here that almost cuts your brain entirely in half. We talked about the TC, which is the fissure down here, can't really see it, that divides the cerebrum from the cerebellum. And then you had the flax cerebella, which divides your cerebellum into two halves. So speaking of the flax cerebri, the flax cerebri is that deep fold that you have on the top of your brain that basically almost completely divides your your cerebrum into two parts. And that's what you're seeing here in the picture. They have not cut this brain open. They've literally pulled it open at that really deep fissure, and you see the left side of the brain and you see the right side of the brain. And we've talked about gray matter and white matter, and how gray matter is on the outside. That's what we call the cortex. And the gray matter doesn't have as much myelin in it, which means those nerves don't make as much electricity. Then we have the white matter on the inside. Those are going to be your real important nerves, like the ones that let you breathe and do things like that, because they're going to have a lot of electricity in them, and they are going to have a lot of myelin, so they're white. Well, where you have this fold, it is so deep, this flax cerebri, that it almost cuts your brain into two parts. And like I said, this brain has not been cut open. They just pulled it open at that fold. But you can see this bridge right here. And this bridge is this thing called the corpus callosum. And what we're looking at here today, you can actually find in your coloring book on page 73. If you flipped your coloring book on page 73, you'll see where it talks about the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebral cortex. And you'll see frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe. And you'll see what's called the longitudinal fissure with the central sulcus, which we've been talking about, and the lateral fissure. And then you'll see the cerebral cortex with white matter and all that stuff on there. Excuse me. But what you're looking at here is what's called the corpus callosum. Now, like we've talked about before, in the case of your flax cerebri, it's so deep it almost divides your cerebrum in half. And remember, the cerebrum is all of this part of your brain here. It's the largest part of your brain that you got. So most of the time when you're looking at the brain, you're looking at the cerebrum. And you've got the flax cerebri, which goes up here. And like I said, that's what they have pulled open so that you can see the parts of the brain here. And that's what gives us what we call our cerebral hemispheres, our left side and our right side. Now, the left side of your brain and the right side of your brain need to be able to speak with each other, because the left side of your brain actually controls the right side of your body, and the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. Well, when you look at something, you have this nice clear picture. You don't have a dividing wall right down the middle of your eyesight. And that's because these two sides of the brain can talk to each other. And that's because you have this bridge right here in the middle. And that bridge is called the corpus callosum. And this is a large bundle of nerves that connect your two hemispheres together and allow your brain to talk. So the left side of your brain can tell your right side of the brain what's going on and vice versa. So when you put something in your left hand, the right side of the brain is what actually registers that. But the right side of the brain can say, hey, by the way, this is what this hand is holding. And later on, we're going to talk about what are called split brain patients. Split brain patients are people with severe epilepsy, and they've gone in and they've cut these nerves. And so their brain, each side of their brain can't talk to each other. And you don't really realize how important this is until you see what happens with split brain patients. But more on that later. But your brain literally is almost two completely different sides, and each side does something a little bit different. And so they have to be able to talk to each other. So literally the left hand has to know what the right hand is doing. Now, like we've mentioned here on our drawing, you have the cerebral cortex and you have the cerebral core. And the cerebral cortex is talked about on page 73 in your anatomy coloring book. And the cerebral cortex, remember, anytime you see cortex, cortex means it's the outside. So all of this here is your cerebrum. Right here would be your flex cerebri. Here's your TC. This is your cerebellum. And back here would be your flex cerebellar. Remember, all of this is your proencephalon. This back here is your rhombencephalon. And remember, your mesencephalon, your midbrain, you can't see from the outside. It's literally in the middle of your brain. And with your cerebral cortex, when you touch the brain, you are touching the cerebral cortex. So you guys know that this is mostly gray matter. And we've already talked about gray matter and how these nerves don't have a lot of myelin on them. So we're not saying they're not important, because they wouldn't be in the brain if they weren't important. It's just that these aren't going to be the nerves that control things like your heartbeat or your breathing. It's going to be, things like memory, smelling, stuff like that. But they are gray matter, so these are nerves that are not highly myelinated. And so again, we talked about how if you were to cut the brain open, so there's your flex cerebri, right there. You've got the left side, you've got the right side. This right here, okay, would be that bridge that we were just talking about. And you can see the real important nerves are going to have all of your white matter. So over here, you've got the cerebellum, the cerebrum. You have the cerebellum. This is your rhombencephalon, that's your TC. This is your proencephalon. And in the case of your cerebella is over here. In the case of your cerebrum is what we commonly call your telencephalon. And it has two parts, the cortex and the core. When we talk about the lobes of your brain, they're going to all be part of your cortex. Now keep in mind, a lot of what we know about the brain is based on patients that have some type of brain damage, because that's the only way we would be able to figure out what the brain is doing. So we're going to look at the different lobes of the brain. Now, real fast, what's that line right there? You better know that that line is the central sulcus, and the central sulcus divides your frontal lobe from your parietal lobe. And back when we talked about the skull, you know that these lobes are named after the bones. So we got the frontal bone, the parietal lobe, the occipital bone, and then the temporal lobe, or your temporal bone. You know that this right here is called the lateral fissure. You can see that that divides your temporal lobe from the other parts of your brain. This right here, if you remember, is your cerebellum. That's your TC right there. So we got central sulcus, we've got lateral fissure, we've got TC. Be prepared for a little quiz on this later on, but we're going to look at the different lobes of the brain. So we're going to start with the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, and the temporal. And again, this goes along with page 73 of your coloring book. And these all make up what we call the cortex, which is part of your telencephalon. Remember, the proencephalon is your forebrain. That is all of this. And the cortex is mostly your four lobes. It's mostly the outside of your brain. And then the core, just like a core of the apple, that's going to be buried inside of the brain. So let's look at the lobes of the brain. Now, in the case of your, what's that right there? That's your lateral fissure. Okay. In the case of your frontal lobe, okay, like I said, a lot of what we know about the brain is based on patients who have had brain damage. And so we still don't know, why the brain works the way that it does. Okay. But like I mentioned, a lot of this, when we talk about the brain, we know from studying patients who've had some type of brain damage or brain trauma. So in the case of your frontal lobe, as you already know, don't need to jot it down, it's located under your frontal bone. Okay? And it plays a role in the following. So on page 73 in your coloring book, you'll see cerebral cortex and you will see frontal lobe. Now you'll see what's called the precentral gyrus and you'll see Broca's speech area. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. But in the case of your frontal lobe, we know that this part of your brain has something to do with memory. Okay? Patients who have had brain damage in this area, their memory is affected. Sorry that this is so jumpy here. Okay? Their memory is affected, and that leads us to know that this has something to do with your ability to memorize things. And it's not necessarily memorizing things, but it's just having your ability to have a memory. People who have this part of their brain damage a lot of times lose either short-term memory or long-term memory. We also know that this part of your brain has something to do with emotions. Okay? And again, this is based on people who have had some type of brain trauma. People who have had this part of their brain damage can lose their ability to feel happiness, or they might lose their ability to be sad. That would be kind of cool in a way. But that's kind of, that Disney movie. But this part of your brain does have something to do with emotions. Anger is not included in this. Anger is a primitive protective measure we have, and that's a whole different group of nerves. This part of your brain also has something to do with your ability to make decisions and reason. And this part of your brain has something to do with personality. A lot of these studies were done on a gentleman named Phineas Gage, and he actually had a pole go straight through his brain. And after he survived, but his personality drastically changed. He actually became a very sullen, very angry person. And so this is one of the first studies that were done on the brain in order to figure out what parts of the brain controlled what. Okay. You also have this area in your brain that's called the Broca's area. Now, as you can see, that is mentioned on page 73 in your book. And the Broca's area has something to do with your ability to speak and understand different languages. And we're going to come back to that later because it works hand in hand with another portion of your brain. Then we have the parietal lobe. Okay, in this picture here, you know that right here we have your central sulcus. That divides your frontal lobe from your parietal lobe. Down here you have your lateral fissure. That divides your temporal lobe from everything else. But in the case of your parietal lobe, again, you know it's found under your parietal bone. And this is what it does. Now on your page, it talks about the parietal lobe, but it doesn't really mention much. Okay? Your parietal lobe does have something to do with a lot of your senses and integrating those senses. So it basically ties senses together. So your ability to touch, when you touch something, this is the part of the brain that tells you what you're touching. It takes physical sensations and ties them with memory. So when you smell French fries, this is the part of the brain that says, hey, by the way, you're smelling a French fry. Or when you see a tree, this is the part of your brain that says, hey, by the way, you're looking at a tree. So that's what we're talking about when it says it integrates your different sensations. It ties the actual sensation with a memory or letting you know what it is that you're doing. It also deals with your spatial awareness and perception. Now, this is not the part of the brain that lets you see. The part of the brain that lets you see is the occipital lobe back here. But this is the part of the brain that basically gives you your depth perception. Like we see in 3D. We can tell when something's close up. We can tell when something's far away. This is the part of the brain that lets you do that. And people who have this part of the brain damaged or have trauma to this part of the brain, they can't tell you if something's close up or far away anymore. Like I said with vision, this is not the part of the brain that lets you see, but this is the part of the brain that interprets what you're looking at. So basically, this is the part of the brain that says, hey, by the way, you're looking at a video. Okay? That's a picture of the brain. These are words. Or you're looking at this and you're like, oh, okay, that's a pencil. So this part of the brain tells you what it is that you're looking at. And this part of your brain has something to do with numbers. And again, remember, we only know this from studying people who have had brain damage. People who have this part of their brain damaged or have trauma to this part of the brain oftentimes lose their ability to recognize numbers. Meaning, for some of them, they can't count anymore. They can't go 1, 2, 3, 4. Or if you show them the number 2, they can't tell you it's the number 2. For some people, they lose their ability to perform basic math, like they can't tell you 2 plus 2 is 4. So it just really depends on what section of this brain gets damaged or how bad the trauma is as to what happens to it, and which is the whole mystery. But again, it has something to do with numbers and math, and this is the part of the brain that basically lets you learn to count. Now, in the case of your occipital lobe, again, you guys know that it's found under the occipital bone, and this is what it does. Its main job is to let you see. So its primary function is the processing, integration of vision. So this is the part of your brain that takes all that information from your optic nerve and allows you to see a picture. And what's pretty cool with the way the lenses in your eyes work, the picture actually shows up in your brain upside down. Your occipital lobe flips it back around. So people who get hit in the head, the back of the head really hard, sometimes complain that everything's upside down. Well, that's because this part of the brain has been affected. Now, in the case of this part of the brain, you do have what we call the primary visual cortex. Again, this is the part of your brain that's responsible for your sense of sight. So this is what takes all that information from your optic nerve and turns it into a picture. This is also the part of your brain that somehow allows you to tell sizes. Sometimes when people have this part of the brain damaged, they no longer understand what large versus small is. Sometimes they have a hard time, we memorize color. We were taught that red is red. We were taught that blue is blue. But sometimes people who have this part of their brain damaged, they're looking at red, but their brain sees blue. Okay? Light, motion, dimensions, things of that nature. Okay? Do not worry about this part here. Okay? Just make sure you know the primary visual cortex. Which then leads us to the temporal lobe. So right here you've got frontal lobe, here you've got occipital lobe, you've got parietal lobe, back here you've got occipital lobe. This is your lateral fissure right there. That's what divides your temporal lobe. And your ear sits right here. So you already know that this has something to do with your sense of sound. Okay? And it's located under your temporal bones, and this is the job that it does. Okay? Hearing. Okay? Obviously, if your ear is there, this is going to be part of the brain that allows you to hear. This part of your brain also plays a huge role in organizing language. We put sentences together. We know what a noun is, we know what a verb is, and so when we speak, our sentences make sense. Well, people who have this part of their brain damaged can actually, their sentences are totally jumbled together. Instead of me and you saying, the car went down the hill, it would be hill went car down. Okay? They lose the ability to organize their language and to comprehend their language. It also has something to do, again, with our memory. Now, something I did forget, let's go back to the parietal lobe. Okay? Just take a note for a second with your parietal lobe. The parietal lobe also contains a part of the brain that's going to allow you to speak. Just kind of jot that down somewhere because we're going to come back to that later. Okay? Now, with your temporal lobe, okay, you have your primary auditory cortex. Cortex lets you know it's on the outside. Auditory, these are the groups of nerves that are responsible for your hearing. You also have this part of your brain responsible for your sense of smell. We haven't talked about your sense of smell yet. And your sense of taste. Remember, 99% of what you think you're tasting, you're actually smelling. These senses go hand in hand. And this is the part of the brain that's responsible for that. Okay. Then you have this thing called the Wernicke's area. This helps you deal with language comprehension. Okay. And I think I said go back to the parietal lobe with the part that allows you to speak. That's my misstatement. It's the temporal lobe, and I forgot that I had it on here, so here you go. This is a part of your brain, and notice it's only on the left side of your brain. So that's why sometimes if people have a stroke on the left side of their brain, they lose the ability to speak. And you're going to see this with split brain patients. I'm going to come back to this with the video. And not to use the pun, but the video is going to blow your mind away because you're not going to realize how your ability to speak, or this area called the Wernicke's area, plays this huge role in you talking and understanding what's going on. Don't worry about that part there. Oh, so a little quiz here. Let's take a look at this. Okay. A, this part right here. Okay. What lobe is that, my dears? Okay. You could do the lobe. You guys know that that could be the parietal lobe, or it could be pointing to this thing right here. What you guys know is the central sulcus. Okay. Letter B over here, it could be pointing to the frontal lobe, or it could be pointing to this thing called a gyrus right there. Letter C, you guys know is the lateral fissure. D is probably pointing to your temporal lobe. E back here, you know, is your TC. That is the fissure that divides your cerebellum from your cerebrum. F right here is probably pointing to your occipital lobe. And I'm going to guess that G was pointing to the parietal lobe and A was pointing to your central sulcus. Oh, so let's see if we were right. We sure were. Okay. Now, you then have this thing called the cerebral core. And the core is going to be this part here. Remember, the cortex makes up most of the outside of your brain. And the cortex are going to be your lobes. The core, like the core of the apple, is going to be buried inside. So this is going to be mostly gray matter, because if the brain gets damaged, this is the part of the brain that's going to get damaged. The core is going to be white matter. It's going to be that real important nerves buried down deep inside of your brain. So in the case of your core, again, it's going to be white matter. And it's going to have a lot of myelin. They're more important, so they're going to be buried. So this is where your corpus callosum will be found. This is where your that little bridge is found. Okay. And there's lots of nerves in there, but I want to just leave off with this thing called the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is a group of nerves that we find inside of our cerebral core, and it helps with the starting, stopping, and monitoring the intensity of movements. Basically, you guys know when you move, it's very fluid. Okay? You don't have this jerky motion to it. It allows you to have these very coordinated movements. And it also allows us to perform several activities at once, which deals with your sense of coordination. Well, studies have shown that this is a part of the brain that gets affected by Parkinson's disease. Now, you know that coordination is skeletal muscle, which is your cerebellum back here. Well, your cerebellum works with your basal ganglia, which is found in this portion of your brain, right there, in order to allow everything to become coordinated. Well, people with Parkinson's disease, as you know, have spasms. Michael J. Fox, Katharine Hepburn, Janet Reno, all of these famous people had Parkinson's disease. And it basically causes their bodies to spasm and convulse. And so they have a hard time brushing their teeth, holding a pencil, things like that. Well, what scientists believe is, for some reason, the basal ganglia gets damaged, and it begins to think that skeletal muscle is smooth muscle. And what does smooth muscle do? Yep, it peristalsis. So the basal ganglia thinks that your skeletal muscle is smooth muscle, so it tells your skeletal muscle to peristalse. And so that's what caused those jerky movements that we find in Parkinson's disease. Now, for many people, Parkinson's disease is genetic, but Muhammad Ali recently passed away from Parkinson's disease, but that was probably due to brain trauma from all the fights that he was in. And that's where we're going to stop with this video, and we'll talk more about the diencephalon, which is your thalamus and hypothalamus, later.